Good evening. Welcome to another developer interview, or just for this week, it's going to be a composer interview here on Game Wisdom for our Perceptive podcast series. My guest tonight is a composer who has worked on a variety of games, including Rosewater that we recently played, as well as a lot of other ones that we'll be chatting about. So please welcome to the podcast this week, Mark Benis. How are you doing?
Great, pleasure to be on and talk to you about music, game design, as you talked with Francisco very recently. But yeah, great to be on.
Yep. And thank you for reaching out and wanting to come on. As Marta said, we kind of met through Francisco, who we did an interview with regarding Rosewater probably about a month or two by the time this cast goes up. So if you missed that chat, be sure to check it out. I'll include a link to that one down below. So, since this is your first time on the cast, Mark, you talk a little bit about what is your background when it comes to the game industry and to composing.
Yeah, so I basically got into video game composition probably around 2017. I was basically fresh out of college. I was trying to think about what I could do with my life, and I knew I loved games. I knew I loved writing music, and that was just a very happy combination of really the stuff that I'm really passionate about. And talking about Francisco, actually, Lamplight City was, I would say, the first real big game that I ended up working on and scoring. I had done, some smaller game jams before that, writing a couple minutes of music, but I went from that into 80 plus minutes of music for Lamplight City. So it was definitely a big project to start, but in a lot of ways, I felt very lucky to have such a creative world that Francisco had made as kind of my first exploration into really writing music for games.
Hmm. When you met Francisco for Lamplight, was it like a case of you like applying to his job, or did you know him like previously? Like, how did you get like in for that?
Yeah, no, it's a fun story. I had moved to New York City in 2017 after school. So I had met him at a playcrafting expo. And playcrafting is an organization in New York City that at the time that I was there did basically four expos every year, one per season. And he was showing an early demo of Lamplight City that had no music, and he was, he didn't, he wasn't advertising it, but he was on the lookout for a composer. So I saw him showing Lamplight City, played the game, realized there was no music, and I kind of asked the age-old question, do you have a composer? And we met through there, and became friends, and and in the end had a very similar vision for what we thought musically could work for Lamplight City. And that ended up being almost a 1960s film noir inspired score, kind of, what's the word, harkening back to some of the greats like Bernard Herrmann, who did all the great Hitchcock films. And that was kind of the space I was thinking in musically. And it just ended up being a really great collaboration that, all really started from me just putting myself out there, going to an expo and saying hi. Yeah.
Right. It seems like all the great adventure game designers these days we have some relation to New York because we were just mentioning Dave Gilbert before we started the recording with Old
Yes.
Skies.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Dave. I haven't written any music for his games. That is the esteemed honor by one of my friends, Thomas Regan, actually did the music for Old Skies. Quick shout out to him. He's an absolutely fantastic composer. But actually, I had met Dave in New York City, and I've done a little bit of work with him on the upcoming Nighthawks, which is a vampire-themed adventure game. So, if anyone's listening, definitely be on the lookout for that, because there's still a lot of great adventure games coming out and in the works. So I think that's
Mhm.
great for everyone who's a fan of that. But yeah, and it just so happens that a lot of them are based in New York City. So yeah, I guess yeah, something's in the water over there that makes people write great stories.
Yeah. Besides Lamplight and Rosewater, have you done composing for any other games lately?
Yeah, sure. There's a game that's coming out pretty soon that I've been working on for a few years. I actually met the developers at NYU because I went to NYU to do a master's in film music and video game music. And I had met a few developers there, and we've been kind of working on this. How do I describe it? It's a mirror puzzle game where
Mhm.
you can walk through mirrors and um, use your reflection to solve puzzles. I'd probably describe it as like a Monument Valley with mirrors is maybe a way to describe it. But so I'd met them through NYU, and that game's finally coming out soon, and that's a score inspired by traditional Chinese music. So I had the really great pleasure and chance to record with an erhu player who, for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with an erhu, it's a I'm sure you might have seen it. It's a string instrument that you hold kind of on your lap like this, and you bow,
Okay.
and it's like a it creates a very like heart wrenching sound, and I'm sure uh, I'm sure if listeners maybe heard it, they would instantly recognize it. But I had the chance to record with an erhu player and my good friend Zach Zinger, who played Zhao on that score, and who actually also recorded Woodwinds on Rosewater. So he's kind of a musician I go back to a lot. And we could certainly talk more about Zach's role in Rosewater because he recorded shakuhachi, alto flute for that score, and there's certain pieces that I just think they would not be anything close to what they are now without his playing. So if there's anything to draw from this quick aside, it's that live musicians make a huge difference, and that's something we can talk more about my process when we get there.
Hmm. Yep. I mean, like when we look at a lot of the indie games that have been released, and some of my favorite games are like the past like 5 to 10 years. We've seen some amazing
Mm,
scores, and definitely like
yeah.
music wise, it's definitely been like a step up in terms of the indie space or that span. Like we've like
Mm,
for like people listening, like we've been covering games now for over a decade, and one of the things that has really been like showing a lot more improvement has been seeing more original scores and music for a lot of these indie titles. And again, like there are people who I guess like this could be a good like first question for you as a composer. A lot of people like as a misconception when it comes to video game music, they always think
mm,
of it as being like either like low quality or nothing but chip tunes or like the music has no real like I guess like staying power in a way. But one of the
mm.
things that we have certainly seen, like in other, besides of course Rosewater and the adventure game genre, there's of course like music from games like Pizza Tower, Project Moon, who's been a developer who's had worked with the band I think Melee. I always butcher their name. That has been
Okay.
putting out like
Mhm.
amazing original music for it, and I think there's been that misconception that like working on like a video game soundtrack or composing for video games is like the lesser. It's not as professional. It's
Mm.
not as important or memorable. But from your own perspective, working with developers, like what do you think about composing for video games these days?
Yeah, I think just kind of from my own personal experience writing music for games, I think from a creative standpoint, games offer you so much freedom to really write music that can dynamically change to the player's actions. The gives you the chance to write music, that captures all sorts of worlds, characters. So definitely from my standpoint, I feel like it's a composer's dream to have the freedom that the creative freedom that a lot of games offer. But I'll also, to talk a bit about the other side that you mentioned, where there is some stigma with video game music,
Mhm.
where to reduce it to a very simple, very reductive kind of stance, you could say, oh, you just write back score for a player walking around, and it doesn't. Some music that's designed to be back score might not
Mhm.
have a catchy melody that people can latch onto, and also that's because as a composer, your job is to ultimately make sure the gamer is immersed in the game.
Mhm.
It's not your job to write a catchy melody every second of the game because if you have all these melodies playing when to maybe take a game like Red Dead Redemption,
Mhm.
when you spend a lot of the game just kind of walking around exploring, if it's filled with catchy melodies, it can ultimately take the player out of the game, you know. But if you, as a composer, design, say, dynamic systems where, you have those moments of not necessarily silence, but low intensity, where it's just ambience, it's capturing the feel. And then for those important story moments or when you're in combat, to interweave and transition into those moments where you have the themes, you have, much more catchy material. Um, I think that creates a more immersive experience and ultimately fits more with the developer's vision and creates a better experience. So this is a long-winded way of saying that some video game music is not the catchy music that you can hum to, but it ultimately serves a purpose. And on the flip side, you also have some fantastic themes being written for big games, for small games, and yeah, I think we're in the best. From the history of starting with Game Boys and the sound chips of the NES to now technical, like if we just talk technologically, we have the most potential as composers nowadays, and I think we're seeing a lot of people use that potential to
Hmm.
write fascinating music and complex music and catchy music that you know it's there's no better time, I think, for video game music.
Mm. Yep. I agree with you on that one. And again, like I see like the same kind of like that kind of like opinion when people talk about every video game is the same, just as every music or every video game song is the same, and it really isn't. And it is impressive to see like how far things have come in that respect. And you mentioned a minute ago about having dynamic soundtracks or dynamic music in games. This is something that I'm kind of aware of this from like playing like the old Payday games, where they have like the music that
Mm.
will, of course, change based on situation at hand. For people who aren't familiar as much with that term, what is like a dynamic soundtrack or a dynamic music for a game?
Yeah, that's a great question and something that we can get into a bit more detail. A lot of games these days, even some indies, but certainly a lot of AAA games, use something we call in the industry middleware. And middleware is essentially a software program that replaces the game engine's audio engine. So um, the common software that people are using, there's two pretty common ones. They're called Fmod and Wise. Wise spelled with two W's in the beginning, so it's a bit of a
Mhm.
funny name. But these two programs actually can be implemented into the game engine, and they allow you to create music that can respond to certain variables that you set in the game. And what we mean by dynamic music for our listeners is music that can respond to the player's actions. Um, so, for example, if you're in Red Dead Redemption 2, use that example, and you encounter an enemy, the game can send our middleware software a signal that says, "Oh, we just encountered an enemy. We are entering combat." And what the composer can do in this middleware, like Wise, is say, "Oh, now that I know that we've entered combat, let's transition our music from this ambient music to our combat music." And a software like Wise allows you to program those changes more effortlessly than if you did it yourself, in Unreal Engine, for example, where you'd have to, and people way back in the day had to manually program crossfades, like
Hmm.
lower the volume of track one as you increase the volume of track two. Back in the day, you probably had to program that exact interaction manually with code. And
Hmm.
nowadays with middleware, you can determine how it crossfades. You could say track one crossfades, exponentially down, and track two, comes in exponentially up. It allows you to do more complicated um, interactivity with audio just much more easily. And as a composer, it also allows you to be more creative because nowadays with technology like Wise and Fmod, when it comes to dynamic music, the limit at this point is our creativity. It's not the technical aspect because most things you can think of are possible in Wise. You can have, say, a container of tracks, say you have a container of 10 random 10-second tracks. You could randomly pick a track, play it, and then randomly select another track and play it. So there's so many ideas that you can implement pretty easily. And I think that's where it just opens the door for dynamic music nowadays.
Hmm. And as you're mentioning, like doing like crossfading, I'm getting painful memories where I had to help someone edit a trailer, like for the first time, and had to try to make all that stuff work myself. And
Yes.
as I was telling Mark before we started, like I am not anywhere near verse in terms of like music composition and all that. So it was definitely a lot of challenge to say the least. But
hmm
you mentioned the software that you mentioned. I've seen like if you've played like video games, I've seen like those like logos like at like the credits for a lot
Yeah.
of them. Has that software like evolved at all over the years? So I've been saying that what since like the I think like early to mid 2000s, maybe being older than that.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not completely familiar with Wise's history, but it's created by a company called Audio Kinetic, and I'm pretty sure they've been around for at least like 10 to 15 years. Because I do remember seeing like an old version of it, and it had a very old Windows 98 kind of look to it. So I'm sure these kind of programs have been around for a long time. And in terms of advancements in their technology. We've definitely seen more spatial audio. When it comes to VR, having when you're looking around, having sounds placed in a three-dimensional field. How what does a sound behind you sound like? And a lot of science has gone into that. That a sound behind you is because your ears are here. You can filter sounds in a certain way so that they sound like they're coming from behind you, and you can pan audio, so you can obviously place it in a kind of a horizontal uh, dimension. So definitely in terms of 3D audio, you've seen a lot of advancements. And um, when it comes to the AAA games, I think those are the games that take full advantage of those capabilities. When you're working in 3D, and not to say that indie games aren't 3D, because obviously there's a lot of great indie games that are in 3D. But when it comes to adventure games or Rosewater, that's obviously all 2D. But there's still space available to take advantage of panning and some of those other techniques I mentioned.
Mm. And with I guess like working with Francisco and like telling more about Rosewater, were you like part of the project like at the very beginning, or like at what point did you like kind of come on to begin composing for the game?
Yeah, I was very lucky in this case where I was basically from with Francisco from the start for Rosewater, and I think that signals a sense, kind of our trust and collaboration, where we had worked on Lamplight City before, and honestly, it just went so smoothly, and I loved working with him. So I was honored that he wanted to bring me back for Rosewater, but my collaboration with Francisco is certainly very. I would almost describe it as effortless because he makes it so easy to bounce ideas off of him. And something that maybe a lot of composers could relate to is sometimes when you're working with a developer or a first time client, you want to send them stuff that's perfect. You don't want to send them sketches because you're like, oh, like are they going to judge me because I send them an unfinished piano sketch, or the mix doesn't sound quite right. But because Francisco and I have worked before, and he knows what, if I send him something early, he knows what it could have sound like after I've recorded the players and fixed up the mix. So I have that freedom to actually send him stuff early, and just once I have a little idea down, I could just send it to him. It could be very rough, and I can just have that freedom to check with him and see what he thinks, that you might not be able to have with a first time client, because there is some of that unspoken pressure that even though you've signed a contract and they trust you, just by bringing you onto their a project can be very personal. So there's already that sense of trust, but yeah, there is that unspoken sense of, oh, I want to make sure it's perfect. But you know, for good or for worse, I don't have that with Francisco because I trust him so much that like if I send him something that is objectively bad or rough, I know he can listen through it.
And I guess to build off of that, for like the people who are watching this right now, I'm assuming we're gonna be having a lot of like indie developers and people who are interested in like looking at getting a composer or working with someone along those lines. So in that respect, could you talk a little bit about kind of like what is the process that you go through when it comes to composing for a game?
Yeah, I mean, if we go all the way from the beginning, obviously the the first step is to find a composer and sit down with them and honestly just have a chat about if you're a developer, what you're making and what your inspirations are, what kind of emotions that you're looking to capture. Um, for me, this might be a more personal thing, but I work off of emotion for a lot of things. When Francisco is describing a certain scene, he may have no art done for it. He might still have a very early idea of what it is, but if he can convey like, oh, I want the player to feel like this, or to take an example, Rosewater's opening cutscene, like it should feel like the start of an adventure. It should feel like we're moving into the West and starting this grand thing. So that instantly gives me cues to take a direction. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So if we're talking to the composer, we obviously want to mention emotions, mention inspiration, any kind of early art, and really from there, as the developer, it's funny talking as a developer because I'm on the opposite side of this relationship. But as a developer, then once you've had that chat, it's really from there seeing like, oh, does this composer get what I'm making? Do they have an idea for the music, a vision for the music that fits my vision and can complement what I'm making? And at this stage, you might ask them to do a demo, to test out those ideas that they're coming up with. Ideally a paid demo, but a lot of composers in the indie space are certainly open to, you know, uh, demoing the music and then if it works getting paid for that. But yeah, then we end up talking about rates and contracts, which in the indie sphere it can be pretty flexible because not a lot of indie games are certainly working with the budgets of AAA games. So that's a conversation that we can we don't have to get into right now, but there's a lot of kind of levers you can pull to figure out a good deal for your composer. But yeah, from there, and I'm sorry this is a very long-winded answer, but from there, it's really then uh, figuring out how much music does this game require, where almost like in film, you have spotting sessions where you'll watch a film with a director and decide where to put music. In a lot of ways, you do a spotting session with a game developer. You ask, where in your game do you need music? How long should it be? And obviously, since games um, are very much determined by the player, and in terms of length of music and length of playtime, a lot of times it's determining, oh, if a player spends an hour, up to an hour, or infinite amount of time exploring an area, then maybe we need to talk about, oh, do we need 4 to 5 minutes of music to cover that area? But for a cutscene, obviously, that's just going to be a short linear section. So um, once you've figured out exactly where you want music to be, then yeah, then you can kind of get to work and start forming that sound. Yeah.
Mhm. And regarding kind of like the payment side of things, obviously, but I don't, you don't have to go into
Mhm.
anything like NDA breaking, but For like developers listening, in terms of like payment, I remember I spoke with a designer. I think
Hmm.
his name was Jonas Turner from a few years ago, who does I think indie music as well as game design. And we got on the topic of kind of like how payment works. Like, do you get paid like
Hmm.
per song, per the length of the song? Is it like a combination of the two? Like, how does like that kind of negotiation go?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because especially if you're a developer who hasn't worked with a
Hmm.
composer before, that might be just a topic that you don't really know how to approach, and you obviously, you know, would like to approach with some knowledge when you end up talking to a composer. So, I'm gonna preface this by saying this is how I do it. There are other composers who do it differently, and there's a lot of options, of course, when it comes to how we discuss payment. But the pretty standard way to figure out payment is we talk in as a rate per completed minute of music.
Okay.
So if you have I'll use a simpler number. Why am I going half an hour? If you have 10 minutes of music and your rate is I'm gonna just throw a random number, $100 per minute of completed music. For the 10 minutes of music, you'd have 10 times the rate, which would be 1,000 in that case. But um, when we discuss rates, that can also be affected by how complex the music is. Or, orchestra music, as a composer, you might charge more than just solo piano music. And the way
Mm-hmm.
I usually do it is I have the rate for me as a composer, but also what I'm trying to do more of actually now is separate that from a recording budget, where I'll have a rate, X per minute of completed music for me composing the music, but ideally also put some money aside to actually record the music with musicians. And when we talk about recording with musicians, the price can vary if you're working with individual session musicians who can record remotely and then send their recordings to me.
Mm-hmm.
That can be that kind of a per hour recording time rate, all the way up to hiring an orchestra, which can be pretty expensive, up to $1,500 to 2,000 per hour of session time. For that's kind of a mid-sized orchestra or a small one. So when you're talking uh, full orchestral scores, stuff that like Gordy Hab and Stephen Barton are doing for Star Wars games. They're getting a full orchestra recorded, and that might not be accessible for an indie game, but definitely something to consider when you're talking budgets. But also, some developers might hear this and think, oh, I might not be able to afford a full rate, but I'll just put it out there. My rate is $700 per minute of completed music, which is a pretty standard rate around for indie composition. And that's for a license, because we also have to talk about there's a difference between licensing out music and doing a buyout. And a lot of AAA games will actually prefer to do a buyout because the company wants to own the music and be able to
Mm-hmm.
do anything they want from it. So a lot of AAA companies and the composers writing music for them are selling basically the complete rights to their music, except certain composer credits from which basically means they would get royalties from like a performing rights organization. Those they would always keep as the composer, but otherwise the company would own it, and those rates can go up to 1,500 per minute of completed music, all the way to you know whatever John Williams could get if he ended up doing video game music. So the rate that I'm talking about, a $700 per minute of music, would be for a license where me as the composer would license to the game developer the right to use the music in any association with the game, but I would still own the rights. So if I put the music and sell it on Bandcamp, or it's streamed on Spotify, exactly that those royalties would actually stay with me. So that's a common agreement for indie composers, so that
Mm-hmm.
they can retain the rights to their music. And if and it's how do I explain this? It's almost an incentive to, as the composer, to really put your all, because if the
Yep.
music does well streaming and selling, then that's also more revenue for you. Um, but that, again, this is all me. This is just my rates, and and I say 700 as kind of a standard, just
Hmm.
because I have colleagues who also use that rate. Um, but also, I mentioned that rate, and still developers might listen to that and be like, oh, $700 per minute of music. You start multiplying that times how much music you want for your game, and you start realizing that's a lot of money. So a lot of composers actually do offer rev share deals, where this is something I've actually done for both Lamplight City and Rosewater, where, say, my rate is X,
Hmm.
but the developer can, maybe only afford half of that. Then we can also open up the discussion and say, okay, I'll take half my rate, but then are you open to sharing a portion of your a portion of your revenue share once the game is released, to cover the rest of my rate, or you know uh, have some other agreement so
Hmm.
that it's not all upfront.
Yep.
um, yeah, and as a composer, that's also, we're going really deep. I hope this is okay.
That's fine.
That's also another kind of a lever that you can move around as a composer. And from a composer's perspective, if we see a game that, I think this game is going to do really well and could sell well, then from our perspective, we would probably feel more comfortable moving into rev share, because rev share is
Hmm.
ultimately riskier than doing everything up front for your
Yep.
rate. Because if you do rev share and then the game never releases, that's the risk you take.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, this is all to say that it's complicated, and business can be complicated,
Yep.
but it's something, if you're a game developer, if you're a composer writing for games, it's something at some point you need to kind of figure out and honestly feel comfortable with. Because when I first started as a composer, it was intimidating to talk about money and to talk about, you know, uh, the idea that someone should pay me for my work as a creative person. But it's
Hmm.
a very important aspect of what we do. And I definitely, where I am in my career now, I feel glad that I've reached a point where I understand it all, and I have that, um, the way, how do I say this? I'm comfortable talking about it. So when I talk to developers, I can explain all of this to them, and so that they fully understand their options, and from there we can have a further discussion on, for this project, what makes sense. And obviously, if I encounter a project I really want to work on that I really love, then my rates become more flexible for sure. Because
Hmm.
there's certain projects that you just, as a composer, just really speak to you. And in some ways, you'll you'll accept basically whatever they can afford to get the chance to do
Hmm.
that kind of work.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
There.
hope that was a was a long-winded answer again, but hopefully really covers a lot of ground there on that topic.
Hmm. And one thing I want to ask you about regarding kind of like working with developer in terms of payment. If a developer, well, like for a lot of indie games these days, we see you can buy the soundtrack or the OST like through the store page and stuff like that. In those circumstances, like, is that like part of the rev share, or is that just like in perpetuity you will receive like a proceed of how many sales of a soundtrack get put out there?
Right. So if I'm understanding correctly, if I, as the composer, give out a license to the
Hmm.
developer, then they can use the music in their game at no additional cost.
Okay.
So if they pay that rate that I mentioned in the beginning, then that's all they'll have to pay. They can then license, since they have the license. It
Hmm.
would be what we call an exclusive, irrevocable license. I can't say the word. You know the word I'm trying to say. And I'm not even gonna try. I can't say it.
That's all right.
But yes, it would be like an unlimited license. Yeah. So in that case, they wouldn't have to pay any additional royalties or anything.
So they can sell the OST and basically they keep the profits at that point?
Oh, sorry. So since it's a license, the composer would keep the uh,
Oh,
the royalties from
okay.
selling the soundtrack. Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. But that's also that opens another door because something I've also done is, you know, since it's ultimately really a collaboration. I also open the door to say I'll split some of the soundtrack royalties with the developer because they're also hosting the soundtrack on Steam. You know, it's very
Mhm.
visible and sold together, you know, in bundles. So that's something I also open the door to, that like, oh, you know, on a platform like Steam, you know, where they're sold together, you know, I'm also open to splitting those royalties, and
Mhm.
that can factor into the entire deal.
Mhm. And another thing that you brought up in terms of like payment and the actual kind of work is that the payment
Mhm.
comes down to every minute of completed music in a game or completed per song.
Yes.
And this is something like for like consumers or enthusiasts like listening to us, a common complaint that I hear regarding like game OSTs or just like game music in general is when the loop is very limited. Like it's only like a a minute to 2 minute long loop. And as you're
Mhm.
describing, I think a really good reason for that, of course, is that if you want like a 5+ minute loop, it's going to start costing you a lot more than that to get that fully done.
Yeah, exactly, and also from the composer's perspective, you know, we're because sometimes loops can have more dynamic layers where you're fading in,
Yeah.
you know, one layer, or you know, that can also add to the composer's complexity. And you know, um, I think some people might not realize where when you're doing those kind of dynamic tracks, you know, the composer's exporting multiple layers. They're, you know, in some cases implementing that music themselves, where definitely in
Mm-hmm.
the indie sphere I've had experience doing that myself. So you know, all that time really does add up. So it might not seem like, oh, it's just 2 minutes of looping music. You know, how complicated can that really be? And it can get, you know, pretty complicated when you start factoring in more dynamic methods and stuff like that. But yeah, and that's ultimately where you know, when you see, you know, some games that can afford a lot of music, and you know, that's brilliant, because then to me what that signals is both developer and any publisher or investors that are involved in that project see the value in the music. And you know, we see games like, was it a Claire Obscure Expedition 33?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not super familiar with the game, I haven't played it, but I've heard the score is something
Yeah.
like 8 hours long. It's a massive amount of music, and that's a case where a developer really understands how important music is. And you know, I've only heard a small portion of it. I really need to sit down and listen to as much of it as I can at some point. But um, you know, a lot of it, I from what I've heard, is recorded live. They had an ensemble and singers perform it, and I just love seeing that. Where you know, they're not a AAA developer, but I wouldn't necessarily call them an indie developer, but they really put their money where their mouth is, and said, we think music is one of the most important aspects of this game. And
Mm-hmm.
you hear it in how it's written, how it's recorded.
Yeah. I think like the last time, or at least like the most recent time, we've seen like kind of like the music become a part of the star of the game like that would be something like a Remedy with Alan Wake 2 and was it Poets of the Fall,
Hmm.
who do a lot of their music and the whole musical number that they showed at the Game Awards. I think that was like another
Hmm.
one of like those like real kind of like breakout moments that people were like, hey, there's this amazing song or amazing OST for Alan Wake. And as we've been talking, like it does really add, especially when you get like the when you get original compositions for these games. And
Yeah.
I guess as a quick question, like to what you were saying a few minutes ago about like when like composer goes to like hire either like local musicians or hires like a full orchestra, is that
Hmm.
something like when you're working with a client or working with a developer, is that something that gets like kind of like factored in, like included to your fee, or is that like something that kind of becomes like an additional cost or additional part of the budget at that point?
Yeah, there's kind of two ways to approach this as the composer side of this, where you can kind of just get a package payment where, for example, this is kind of how I did it for Lamplight City, where we estimated about how much music the game will need, and that's just from talking to the developer, kind of doing a spotting session, like we mentioned, and then have that estimated amount, let's say 60 minutes for simplicity, and then just multiply that by our agreed upon rate, and then you just have that package amount, and then from that amount, it's just my responsibility to record whatever we need and
Mm-hmm.
contract musicians to record. So that's the way I've done it before. I think, um, personally, for me, a way that I would prefer to do it more in the future is to have those two ideas a bit more separated, which is something we kind of did for Rosewater, where um, we have our composer rate for writing per minute of completed music, but then also have a discussion on top of that of how much money we want to budget out to record for live musicians. So just to take Rosewater as an example, we ended up budgeting around $2,000 to record all our live musicians, and that was just a number we had, from the start, that like, oh, that would probably cover, for the amount of music we're going to need for this game, that would cover a lot of the essentials. And so that was brought up pretty early, but then we factored that in as part of an overall package deal, and then with that, and then I just kind of go off and then become
Mm-hmm.
the budgeter on my side, because if obviously I'd love to have everything recorded. I'd love to have this score with a full orchestra, but then the budget would just not be able to cover that. So as a composer, you do have to do a bit of um, management on that side, because there's a the devil on your shoulder saying like, oh, spend more money, get more live musicians, but there's the angel also saying, I don't know, maybe they're both devils saying you don't need live musicians because it's going to cost a lot of money. Actually, I think they're both devils, because I don't think either is an angel, because you know um you know, as a composer, you want everything just to, ideally, if you can, you want everything to be live. You want a real person to play your music and add that little, je ne sais quoi that you would never think on your own as a composer. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just so to answer your question, it's usually factored into a package amount, but something I'm doing and other composers are doing are separating those. So we agree on that, on an amount for recording, but also you what's the word, notice or acknowledge that just writing the music deserves its own rate, also, because that's ultimately a separate thing from getting it recorded.
Mm-hmm. And that is definitely another aspect, like for developers watching who probably don't have too much of an experience with when it comes to actually writing the music before you even get to record and do stuff like that.
Hmm.
So I guess that's, I think, a really good lead in for this next question then. With working with Francisco or working with like developers in general, what's kind of like the process you go through going from talking with a developer about their game or about a scene they want to do to actually going through the whole thing to making an original song or composition for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ultimately, from those initial discussions with a developer, for me, that usually gives me an idea on instrumentation. What instruments, what sound fits this world for the game, and just to use Rosewater as the example. We knew it was going to be a western. I was with Francisco from the start, so that afforded me the time and the opportunity to really figure out what direction I wanted to go in. And so, since I knew it was a Western, and Francisco had certain inspirations he mentioned to me, those being Red Dead Redemption, Red Dead Redemption 2, that kind of world. of westerns that are maybe more modern. But for me, also, I grew up on classic western films, so stuff like Shane. Which composer is that? Is that Max Steiner? Max Steiner, a brilliant film composer. There's The Big Country, which was Jerome Moroz, probably one of my favorite Western themes. Whoever's listening, just pause this, go search The Big Country main theme, listen to it, and just marvel at how great it is, and then come back. Okay, you're back. So stuff like that is just absolutely brilliant writing for the West, and that was one of my big inspirations. The Searchers, that's another great Western film score. So for me, it growing up on that live orchestra sound, that um, that filmic kind of world that it creates. I wanted to pay some homage to that, and you definitely hear that in the main titles track, 743 to Rosewater, where it's ultimately a fanfare. It's the start of an adventure. It's a title. It's a main titles. You know, a theme where you're starting the game. So that was certainly a big influence for me. And we also have slightly more modern takes, like Ennio Morricone, who did Once Upon a Time in the West, which is, I guess, still an old movie, but also, what was it, like The Hateful Eight, and that kind of spaghetti western sound. So there's a lot of inspiration out there for the western genre, and um, which is good to have as a composer, but you also want to create your own voice. I think every composer can have this challenge where you have all these inspirations, but you also want to bring your own voice into it. And for me, that was a bit easier in this case for Rosewater, because Lamplight City, I had done the music for that, and Rosewater actually takes place in the same world of Lamplight City. So I drew upon some themes from Lamplight City, some references, um, and I also ended up creating original themes for Rosewater. One of them being, I call it the Rosewater rhythm. You hear it in the main title track, and honestly all over the soundtrack. The rhythm is da 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 da, and from there, that was kind of my main theme. And it has a um, pitches to it, but it's not necessarily hummable. But I love the idea of using a rhythm as a theme instead of necessarily something more melodic or um, hummable or singable. Um, so that was kind of a not necessarily a challenge to write, but a self-imposed challenge where I felt inspired by this rhythm, and I wanted to see how far I could take it. And so if you end up listening to the soundtrack and listening closely, you will hear that rhythm almost in almost every track. And it's just something I use to make something my own and have all the music sound like it fits together and fits on the same soundtrack.
Mhm. And making sure that it all fits, I think that's another very interesting aspect of this. Like, obviously, with the
Hmm.
games that we've seen, like here on the channel, like there is a very wide spectrum in terms of games. That also means in terms of how the music works for it. There are
Hmm.
titles where, with each world or each level, whatever, being its own unique ecosystem, means that it can require completely different music. We see this especially in like the 2D platformer genre, where you go from
Hmm.
fire, ice, and Sonic, Casino
Yes.
World, city, whatever, that you can have completely different music that it can almost feel like you're playing like 4 or 5 games worth of music in that respect. Or in a case like with Rose War, with everything being tied to the same world that Francisco developed with Lamplight, it still has to be.
Hmm.
I guess like, how do you like think about things in terms of creating like, I guess like one like a harmonizing of like each music or each theme to this world.
Yeah, no, that's a really good topic to bring up, because they're almost polar opposites that are fighting each other. Where if you have like you mentioned, a unique world, a fire world, a water world. You want them to feel unique and feel like they capture this different area. But on the other side, you also want to make sure everything sounds like it's one soundtrack, and that can kind of get into you know mixing approaches where we can get into like reverbs or other processing techniques where you might have you know an instrument processed in the same way, but you know it can sound one way for the fire world, but with the same processing on a different instrument sound make it sound like for a water world or something. But instrumentation can also be a gluing factor in a lot of cases where um, if we take Lamplight City as an example, it covers multiple parts of the game. Kind of covers multiple parts of the city and has different emotions are touched upon in each of the cases. But for me, that's the central glue to Lamplight City was ultimately its instrument palette, where it's mostly orchestral, but a decision I made pretty early on for that game was that there are actually no woodwinds on Lamplight City, and that was in some ways a creative choice and also a financial choice because at the time that I was writing that score, um, as composers, we have to buy sample libraries if we're not going to record with an actual orchestra. And these sample libraries for orchestras are expensive. They can
Hmm.
be $500 to $700 per instrument family. So the strings could cost $500, the woodwinds could cost 700, the brass could cost another 600, and sometimes you want to mix libraries, so you get multiple string libraries from multiple companies, and you can easily see how the costs just to get started writing orchestral music can absolutely balloon, especially if you want to use good samples. Excuse me, good samples that you're confident actually using in a commercial production. Um, so those costs can add up, and that was also a creative decision where if I said, I can't afford woodwinds, I'm not going to use them, but by creating that limitation, I'm actually zeroing in more on a very identifiable sound, because instead of woodwinds, I said to myself, why don't I use hammered dulcimer? Why don't I throw in, like bowed vibes and vibraphone and, all these other colors that can make the soundtrack more unique and have its own character. So ultimately, instrumentation is a good way to um, figure out from the beginning and have a sense of glue to things. For Rosewater, that was shakuhachi ended up being an instrument that in some ways represented adventure and the frontier. So that was a unique choice. And for anyone who's not familiar, a shakuhachi is a Japanese bamboo flute.
Hmm.
Um, so not normally associated with Western, the Western genre, but I love the sound, and I have a good friend named Zach Zinger who's an incredible woodwinds player, and I met him in New York City. Actually, he's excuse me a New York City native, and from there I knew I wanted to work with him on something, and Rosewater just seemed like the perfect opportunity. So to kind of summarize, I think instrumentation plays a big part in finding that glue, but you also want to make different parts of the game sound unique and have a unique identity. So there is a bit of a give and take with that.
And speaking of give and take, like as another like question, like for I'm sure developers listening, like when you're like doing like this part of the process, coming up with the different compositions, different themes you want
Mhm.
for a game, I guess how does does developer input come into play here? Like, do they tell you I'm looking for a very like high octane song, or I'm looking for a very passive, or like I guess like what is like that kind of entail?
Yeah, that's a good topic to discuss kind of in more detail. I think kind of going back to something I mentioned earlier, talking in terms of emotion can be very helpful here because sometimes some developers might not know how to talk musically, or they might not be musically trained in the sense that you know they know they want tremolo strings and harp glissando that goes up here. Like they may not be able to verbalize that kind of specific detail, but everyone can talk in terms of emotions. That's a
Mhm.
universal language. You can talk in terms of emotions with animals. Animals understand emotions. So it's a very universal language. And uh, when it comes to Francisco, he's actually also a musician. So he plays he ended up actually playing some instruments on Rosewater, and like jaw harp, didgeridoo. So for in the case of Francisco, it's a bit easier to talk with him when it comes to specific musical ideas. But even though he may know some of those concepts, I still find it more useful actually to talk in terms of emotion, where um, let's say if a character dies, that's you know, we're if we're on the same page that we want it to be like a funeral dirge. It needs to be mournful. It should also, capture the person, some character of the person who died, or so that I find is very useful to actually discuss. But it kind of depends on the ability of the musical ability of the developer. But in some ways it's not really, musical knowledge isn't really necessary, because we can, it's ultimately my job to translate
Mhm.
our discussion about what a scene needs or what a piece needs into um, a musical representation of it. And something that I find really creative as a composer is sometimes your first association or your first assumption on what you should do musically isn't always the best option. It isn't always the most fitting option. Just to take an example from Lamplight City, actually, um, there's these two detective partners, Miles and Bill, and an instrument I wanted to use to represent their partnership, and also, you know, not to spoil too much, but a tragic scene that happens between the two detectives. For some reason, the harp just came to me, and harp might have a more traditional association with romance or something light and airy. But I ended up using harp as a pretty main instrument, using its low end, and uh, to give their partnership a different color, because obviously they're not a romantic partnership, but they're a detective partnership, to give that kind of an edge or a different side. And also when it comes to the tragedy that happens between the two, to use the very low end of the harp as like a almost menacing and scary sound. So sometimes it's not the first idea that can be the more interesting idea, because we also have thousands of years of history for music that have created these associations for us, just through all the music that we love. So sometimes it's better to go against that, to think what's a unique association I can make myself to set things apart.
I guess to build on top of that, in terms of like creating a composition or creating a song for a game like this, we mentioned earlier, of course, the whole idea or the challenge of payment in terms of
Mm.
each workable or each usable minute. With like thinking about music like for a game, how does the length play a factor into this? Because as we said, like in a beautiful world, we could just have unlimited time for every song, and we
Yes.
have to worry about things. But when you're trying to create like a mood or a theme for a specific area, how does like that length come into play? Because you can, as we've said, like you can have a song that's so long or so engaging that kind of takes you out of that scene because you're too focusing on that.
Mhm.
Just you can have something that's like so generic, or it's just like it just becomes like white noise in the background for what's happening.
Mm. Yeah, and it it kind of goes back to our previous discussion where when we're doing a a spotting session with a game developer, um, we're ultimately, though we might not be saying it outright, we're also figuring out how long do we expect a player to spend in these parts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to take an example, a lot of people are familiar with, when you when you win a battle, you have a little victory theme, and uh, most of the time, when people are on a victory screen, they're probably mashing the A button to get through it as quick as possible after when you're halfway through a game and you've already seen it and what happens after you win a battle. So the player might spend like 10, 15 seconds on that screen. So if you have that foresight that, oh, players probably are not going to spend a lot of time on this, I probably only need to do a 20 to 30-second loop. If, even if that, those are places where, you know, it doesn't need a 2-minute loop because most players actually probably won't even hear past the 30-second mark. So when we start talking about budgets and how to efficiently use the music that you're paying for if you're the developer, those are cases where um, you just have to make that educated choice to say, we don't need a lot of music for that, and if we're talking about exploration, where versus the 15 seconds they're spending on victory screen, if they're spending 90% of the game exploring, then you want to invest more of your time budget. If we're talking, if you're the developer and you pay for 20 minutes of music, and 90% of the game is exploring, probably makes sense. It might even make sense to do a 10-minute loop or have 10 minutes of music somehow dynamically accompany those parts. So really, it's up to the developer and the composer to acknowledge where is the player going to spend the most time in and put most of the energy into that. Like, for some reason, this example is coming to me, Balatro, which I'm sure a lot of people listening are familiar with that. Um, that is actually a good example of dynamic music because I think I don't have the exact numbers, but obviously we have the main theme. But then when you're actually playing, the game transitions between different themes. Like when you're opening a pack, there's a certain theme you have there, and I don't have the exact lengths, but a player might sit there for a considerable amount of time as they're considering their options, and really deciding, oh, which card do I want to put this this effect on. So uh, for a lot of games like that where players might be thinking, that's where you need to consider, oh, maybe a longer loop would be uh, a fitting investment there. So yeah, it ultimately requires just some knowledge of how people will play the game, and that's through play testing, through the developers' experiences, and yeah, and a discussion about it.
Mm-hmm. And to go back to what we were talking about earlier with dynamic music or like dynamic interactions with the
Hmm.
music itself, how does that get like factored, I guess, like lengthwise in terms of like creating like a track? Like if, as you said, if, let's say we have like a 5 minute loop, 5 minute loop composition, but then you want to throw in like some dynamic music, like if there's a fight, if there's something scary, does that get like does it become like 5 minutes plus a minute of dynamic? Is it just like 6 minutes of music? Like how does that get like kind of like factored into like more on the production side of things or management side?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good kind of subtlety to bring up because even though it's still 5 minutes of music,
Mm-hmm.
on the composer side, when it comes to implementation or exporting our actual sections and the actual production work, that can actually add a fair bit of time and work to
Mm-hmm.
our side of the production. So something I would usually do, or maybe recommend if composers are listening to this, is have some sort of like multiplier, or consider adding extra when you're asked to do those kind of dynamic mixes, where I'm just going to throw a random number, where if you're doing multiple layers for a track, consider charging 1.5 times your rate for that instance. you know so you do acknowledge, in some way, financially and through the budget, that that's going to take you more time to do. um, and if you're implementing it, and how do I explain this? If the developer wants you to change something and you're also implementing it, then you have to say re-export your 4 different layers, and then you need to replace all of the files in Wise, and sometimes if lengths are changing for the track, then you have to readjust a lot of things in Wise. So these things can add up, and um, ideally you want to somehow acknowledge that when you're putting a contract together. But um, in some ways, I think a lot of composers can relate to this. Sometimes you'll sign a specific agreement when you first start working on a project, but not all projects are going to stay exactly how the developer imagined it when they first actually signed with you to be on the game. So sometimes the you know there might be additional music that needs to be written, or a track might now need to be dynamic that wasn't dynamic before. And you know as a composer, I've also done it where uh, if they're just small changes, you just kind of take that in as the whole contract. And I don't know if that's something you've experienced on your own side as a game designer, where, oh, the scope's totally changed now, and do I charge more? Do I have to revisit a contract? So that can be something to kind of bring up, and something I've also had to revisit in how I do contracts now, where I ultimately try to do an estimation for my contracts, where we might have, if we're just starting the game and we're not perfectly sure how much music is going to be needed, we create an estimate. And and if it goes above or below that estimate by like a couple minutes, then we open up negotiations again. But there's even high profile examples of composers who sign for a certain number of music but then end up overwriting. I think that's a common, I don't know if I would say pitfall for a lot of video game composers, but it's a side of the business that um, a lot of people maybe accept, or you know acknowledge that it's just part of it. That sometimes your contract, your not necessarily your contract, but the requirements of the game are going to change, throughout development, and sometimes you have to roll with it, and other times, if it's a lot of changes, you want to bring that up and renegotiate.
And that actually brings up a very interesting question I'm going to ask you regarding rewrites and having to redo things. Like,
Yes.
for myself, like I work with an illustrator for the cover arts for my various books, and we have in our contract,
Hmm.
a fixed number of edits or rewrites that we can do. When it comes to music, obviously, I'm sure there must be something similar. Especially again, we're talking about, you mentioned a minute ago about when you have dynamic music, when you have
Hmm.
multiple different threads or multiple different themes all going at the same time. So I guess like how does that work, or like how do you factor in having to do rewrites or even just recomposing these songs?
Yeah, and that's interesting that you have a clause for that yourself with
Mm-hmm.
your illustrator, because I do have a small section on that in my contracts, that I've fortunately never had to use, because when it comes to Francisco, I think I'm a bit spoiled, where
Mm-hmm.
I would say 90% or even a little bit more than that. Most of the music I've written for Rosewater and Lamplight City was basically the version you hear in the game is basically the first version I wrote, but obviously produced more after I've sent it over to Francisco. But there have been cases in Rosewater where I first wrote a track and it wasn't quite what Francisco was imagining, and I've had to rewrite it. Yeah, and that's That's part of my contract where I I forget my exact terminology, but I kind of classify them in two different categories, like a significant revision versus a minor edit. Where to
Mm-hmm.
me, I have unlimited minor edits. Where like a minor edit might be, oh, can you just mute the oboe? Like I don't like the oboe. Can you mute the oboe? Like yeah, that's not a problem. But like when I classify significant revisions, that's like complete rewrite, nothing's the same, and that's where I have it in my contract to have a certain limit of those, or
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like if I'm doing so many of those complete rewrites, I think that it becomes more an issue of actually communication, where it's like, am I just not understanding
Mm-hmm.
exactly what the developer wants, or are they not communicating it in a way that I'm absorbing, that I'm really understanding what they're doing. So, I think I have up to 3 of those, but, I think when you get to more of that, it could be a sign that maybe you just need to talk more and really figure out a bit more. But, yeah, I've been fortunate to never have to use that, but I think it's an important thing to have. Um, and, I don't necessarily have something that says, like, uh for every additional revision, you pay me X more. But I think if you're hitting a certain amount, I think it's good to open up a discussion, um,
Mm-hmm.
on whether or not you're getting it down. But you also, but I've seen people who have the opposite opinion, where if you're a composer and you're brought onto a project, you're ultimately a collaborator, and as a collaborator, you should be willing to do anything necessary to make the
Mm-hmm.
project as good as it can be. So I've seen both sides. Some people I know, some composers don't include it at all and acknowledge that it's part of the process. But um, I think that can open up, what's the word? Not necessarily abuse, but being taken advantage of in some ways, in the sense that like, oh, they don't respect your time. They kind of think your time as
Mm-hmm.
disposable. So I think it can open the door to some of that. So I think somewhere in the middle is probably a healthy approach to it.
It's that time again. We're going to be splitting up our cast as we went for about another hour, discussing more about composing, production, and everything else to go with making music for a video game. Part 2 will be going up real soon. Let me know what you think about this one down below. And I hope you enjoy things and come back for the conclusion to this cast coming really soon.